Hello and welcome to the Global Hearth. My name is Emma Rose Lynn and I'm your host, and we're here today in studio with Tuong Vu. Tuong is a professor of political science at the University of Oregon, where he's taught since 2008. He's also served as department head and is the founding director of the U.S. Vietnam Research Center, which is hosted by the Global Studies Institute. His academic career has included visiting appointments at Princeton University, Seoul National University, and the National University of Singapore, and he's also taught at the Naval Postgraduate School. Professor Vu's research interests are in comparative politics, state formation, national development, revolutions, nationalism, and ideology in East and Southeast Asia. He frequently writes and comments on topics related to Vietnam, communism, republicanism, and Vietnamese American history. He serves on the editorial boards of several academic journals and is regularly consulted by international media on issues concerning Asian politics. Tuong Vu, thank you so much for being with us and welcome to the Global Hearth.
Thank you very much, Emma.
I wonder if we could start by orienting ourselves to not only your topic of interest, but the way that you approach it. So you're trained as a political scientist, and you write comprehensively about history and politics and ideology, especially in Vietnam. And I'm wondering, when you're reading archival sources and you're studying the history of Vietnam, what kind of details and stories are you paying attention to as a political scientist? Or in other words, what kind of perspective does political science offer this topic that might be missed through a different approach, such as military history or cultural anthropology? Or is it a summation of many, many different kinds of approaches?
I was trained in the PhD program at the University of California, Berkeley, which is very strong in an approach called comparative historical analysis. So our approach to the studying of politics is through history. So we examine historical patterns to understand contemporary politics, to explain what's going on in politics. So I'm very interested in explaining broad patterns of history, then through those broad patterns explain politics at this contemporary moment. When reading the archival documents, I am interested in individual stories of people so that I can understand how people experienced and understood the events that were happening around them. And besides, I wanted to understand when key decisions were made, and so that shaped key historical events. For example, I found a memoir by this young communist revolutionary who went to the Soviet Union for training in the science of making revolution in the late 1920s when Russia was under Stalin. Right? This revolutionary was so mesmerized by the Soviet ideology and the methods of social reform under Stalin. And he talked a lot about how the Soviet state was trying to eliminate religion by cutting off electricity to the churches. And then they were trying to involve ordinary people in the court system to allow the masses to participate in delivering the verdicts in public trials of criminals, for example. So he was very mesmerized, very captivated by the communist ideology and how it was being implemented in the Soviet Union. I found a letter written by Ho Chi Minh. He was a young revolutionary back then, also under training in the Soviet Union at the same time in the late 1920s. So Ho Chi Minh was staying in a dorm while going to school there. And the letter complained about the high rental fee that he had to pay, despite the fact that the room that he was renting was full of bed bugs. So these detailed history kind of stories of individuals allow me to portray these young revolutionaries as real people with deep ideological commitments, but at the same time they were not naive. They knew the problems that the Soviet Union were having, but then at the same time they were still deeply attached to it. And that kind of gave me an understanding of history, from the ground up. Then political science concepts help me to build on the individual stories to understand the broader patterns of political change in Vietnam, to explain, for example, why the Vietnamese Revolution succeeded and how did ideology impose a limit on its achievements. How did ideology constrain the leaders from achieving peace and happiness for Vietnamese people, for example. Also, political science helped me to explain broad patterns of history, but then the stories helped me to give a sense of reality to my analysis.
Wow, thank you for that. I'm already thinking about the micro-macro that's involved in your work and how conflicts or how history gets portrayed in the news. That is a very fast-paced, moving cycle, but the work that you're doing seems much more grounded in personal stories. And
well, the public also expects us as political scientists to help them understand contemporary affairs, like the recent rise of the new leader in Vietnam. So I got lots of phone calls and emails from the international presses to ask me to explain why this is happening and what is the significance of it and what is the implications for Vietnamese future and so on. They don't ask historians, they ask political scientists. So I'm supposed to know about contemporary politics and being able to explain and think about the implications for the future and not just the past.
yeah. Well, I wonder if we could then ground our conversation now in the present of what's happening in Vietnam with To Lam's rise to power. And could you help orient us to the significance of his current leadership in Vietnam and maybe even help us draw the connection to the U.S. Vietnam Research Center and the work that you've done to look at the history of the U.S.-Vietnam relationship? Could you explore that for us?
So the rise of General To Lam is spectacular because he was only middle rank in the Politburo, which is the top executive policy-making body of the Vietnamese government and party. He was ranked somewhere in the middle among 17 members. So no one expected him to become the top leader within 2 years. But then by skillful maneuvering, he was able to rise to the top within 2 years. And the fact that he spent his whole career in the security apparatus, the police, and he brought with him to the Politburo several other police generals. And so the security apparatus now dominate the Politburo of the Vietnamese Communist Party, which is unprecedented in the party's history. They have been well integrated into the party, but then never at the top level of leadership like they are now. So what are the implications of that? First, the police has always been supporting repressive measures of civil society in Vietnam. And Vietnam has already been a very repressive country with severe violations of human rights. So the implication of the rise of these security men to the top leadership doesn't mean well for Vietnam's civil society and political conditions. And the second implication is about economics, because the police is also the most corrupt institution in Vietnam. And their rise to domination signal the increase in corruption in Vietnamese system. And it may cause economic instability, economic bankruptcy of the state, and more political instability to follow. So those are the two main implications of this.
One thing that we noticed when we were reading a little bit of your work, you were recently quoted in the New York Times about this particular issue. And we noticed that you were quoted by name, whereas a lot of sources that were quoted in that article chose to remain anonymous. Do you have a sense of why that was or what that choice meant to you? Is that significant?
Well, I made the decision early on in my academic career to just speak my mind, to avoid censor myself. I came from Vietnam to the US 35 years ago, and politics is a taboo in Vietnam, so you're not allowed to talk politics in Vietnam freely. And so when I came to the US, I decided to study political science to understand politics better and to become a scholar. And now that I have achieved my dream, becoming a scholar and being able to understand Vietnamese politics and politics in general, I feel like I have the responsibility to encourage others to pursue their interest in this field without feeling fear, being able to speak their mind and not worrying about the political consequences. That's why I never asked to remain anonymous. Of course, there are big risks. So I've been followed around by the police whenever I visit Vietnam, even though they haven't harassed me yet, but that is quite possible. But I believe it's worth the risk. And also the Vietnamese government should know that I mean no harm to them. Even though I criticize their policies, I mean no harm to them. And back to a question that you asked earlier about the U.S. Vietnam Research Center, the idea to found a center came after a long process of thinking about scholarship. And then when the opportunity came from an offer of funding, then I just took it. So there wasn't a moment when I felt like, we had to do something. It came about as a result of a long process of thinking about my scholarship. And after more than a decade teaching and doing research, I realized huge gaps in the scholarship. There's gap in the study scholarship on Vietnamese history. So the scholars tend to identify communism with the Vietnamese nation. And that is wrong because there were a diversity of political ideas and political movements throughout Vietnamese history, modern history. And the communists actually were the latecomers, and they were a minority, a radical minority on the fringe of society of the nationalist movement. So if you identify them with the Vietnamese nation, that's a huge mistake because you overlook a lot of other ideas and movements. And building on that, that's called misunderstanding of Vietnamese history. Scholars of the Vietnam War think of the war as a conflict between the U.S. and the Vietnamese nation, ignoring the South Vietnamese side, which represented Republican ideas and visions of Vietnam. And the South Vietnamese side was fighting for that vision. And even though they lost the war, they were part of the Vietnamese nation. And so communism did not represent the Vietnamese nation. And the U.S. or the war in Vietnam was essentially a conflict between two contending visions of Vietnam, a civil war among Vietnamese. And the U.S. intervened, but then to try to help the Republican side. And U.S. failed, whereas the communist bloc tried to help the communist side, and they succeeded. But then U.S. intervention was only part of the long history of the civil war between the two Vietnamese groups. And finally, there's one more problem with that misunderstanding of the Vietnamese history. Is
framing the conflict as like a U.S. versus communism in Vietnam. That's kind of a common framing of the war, and you're saying that's a basic misunderstanding of how the conflict was experienced in Vietnam.
That's right. So the conflict began as a civil war, as a conflict among Vietnamese of different ideologies, long before the U.S. intervened in Vietnam. And after the U.S. withdrew from Vietnam, they continued to fight. And after the end of the war, with the defeat of the South Vietnamese side, the North Communist side still continued war with social forces that ally with their enemy.
Thank you for breaking that down, because I think for most people in America, there's a very standardized way that this conflict is taught, and it's taught from the American perspective. And what I've learned through your research is that your scholarship is bringing a really different level of integrity to this history and to the political movements that were involved, because you're working with these primary sources, which are in Vietnamese, and that you're bringing those sources into the conversation in a way that, like you mentioned, there's been a gap in that scholarship. And one of the things that I'm curious about is that you've started an archive. Could you tell us about the digital archive that you've started through the U.S. Vietnam Research Center?
Oh, yes. We are very interested in creating archives, and we have created 2 or 3 archives already, and we are continuing doing so. And we're interested in archive because, like I said, there's so much misunderstanding and confusion about Vietnamese history. And since taking power, the communist government has tried to create propaganda and a narrative for their success, telling their stories, whereas the stories of other groups in Vietnam have been sidelined, forgotten. But then they're not fully lost. They kind of, scatter around in many places. So we wanted to help collect and preserve and provide these documents, authentic artifacts of history to researchers, to students of Vietnamese history and politics, and to the public, and also to the next generations, preserve them for the next generation so they can create a fuller understanding of Vietnamese history.
Is there a particular story that's in the archives that you really appreciate or that surprised you that you'd like to share with our listeners?
After we gained attention from the community for our work, many members of the community began to donate to us items for us to help them to preserve. And we also collaborate with other community organizations to promote the effort. And so one family of the prominent First Lady of the First Republic of Vietnam, South Vietnam, they decided to donate to us the 4 boxes of documents that the First Lady carried with her out of Vietnam back in the 1960s. And also a set of 16 outside dresses that she brought with her. And the First Lady at the time was famous for her knowledge of fashion and her ability to project a sense of Vietnamese nationality through her dressing. And so they donated to us those artifacts, and we were able to collaborate with the College of the Holy Cross in Massachusetts to have an exhibit of those dresses. And then we also borrow dresses from another First Lady together for exhibit there last fall. There were thousands of visitors to that exhibit, and we were very proud of what we have done, and we plan to have it travel to other places, including the UO if possible.
Wow. Oh, if that comes here or anywhere else it goes, we'll be sure to let our listeners know. Was there anything that you learned about her as a person from those documents?
Well, besides the exhibit, I also edited her posthumous memoir and have it translated because she wrote it in French, so we have it translated into Vietnamese and English, and we published both. The English version came out last year, and so I read the memoir, and it gave me a lot more understanding of her time and herself as a person, because she was much maligned by the society and the press at the time, by men who saw her feminism as being threatening. So I learned a lot about her as a person and the politics of the time through the memoir.
Wow. Did she have a sense of the way that the patriarchal dynamic played into that it was a counterattack against her feminism?
So she sponsored a law that banned divorce and also banned men from having concubines, which was a common practice for men of power in Vietnam at the time, a wealthy man at the time in Vietnam. So men usually had several concubines. She didn't like that, so she sponsored this bill to ban that practice and also ban divorce. She's a Christian. And that was attacked by many men. She was viewed as arrogant. She was called a Dragon Lady, tiger, because she was fierce, but she was very beautiful, and that was part of her allure, attraction. But then she also spoke her mind that many people felt offensive, and that's why she was criticized a lot in the media at the time.
You've written and spoken about ideological control. and the limits of expression under Vietnam's one-party system. For Vietnamese scholars who work or travel in the U.S., like I'm hearing some of the kind of historical examples of that in this story. What kind of topics or critiques do you see Vietnamese scholars exploring in the U.S. that would be difficult to explore in Vietnam, or vice versa? Can you help us understand the difference in the political atmosphere in terms of freedom of expression and scholarship?
Yeah, most scholars from Vietnam who travel or work in the U.S. are natural scientists. For the few social scientists from Vietnam, they tend to avoid political topics and sensitive issues. They still want to return to Vietnam and they don't want to offend the Vietnamese government. And I am totally sympathetic with that. I don't have any problem with that. For American scholars here, many of them actually self-censor themselves because they still, they don't want to be denied access to Vietnam because many of them need to go to Vietnam to do research there, so they don't want to be denied access. They also avoid making open or direct criticisms of the Vietnamese government. And also, some of them also think that the U.S. has no right to criticize Vietnam, after our intervention there. And I know one prominent political scientist here, American, who went to Vietnam and introduced himself as an economist. He's not introducing himself as a political scientist because politics is sensitive in Vietnam. So he introduced himself as an economist. And his method is kind of quantitative method. So he can legitimately saying he's an economist, but then he's actually a political scientist.
I want to bring us back to the way that the U.S. involvement in Vietnam has shaped and kind of warped the telling of the story of the Vietnamese War. And if you were to center or choose a political event in Vietnam, where would you orient the beginning of the story of the Vietnamese conflict?
Well, I could start with the beginning of the 20th century when the earliest nationalists and Republicans emerged. So these activists and intellectuals, they learn Western political concepts from Japanese, Chinese, French thinkers, and they developed a vision of Vietnam's future as a democratic republic. So a republic not to be ruled by foreigners, not to be ruled by kings, a republic to be ruled by a government of the people, for the people, by the people. So they developed these ideas and they attracted a lot of following, but then they were suppressed by the colonial regime. And then later on they lost to the communists who received substantial support from the Soviet bloc. So that's why they lost. So I could start story from there, from that moment, to show how the Vietnamese have very different visions of their future and they fought against each other. And it was actually a civil conflict and not an American war with the Vietnamese nation as commonly portrayed in the scholarship.
When you look at the anti-war movement during the Vietnam War in the U.S. by mostly white American, the hippie movement here in the U.S., what may have been overlooked by that movement, given the way that conflict played out? Like, people talk about it as the first televised war in the United States, and it was initiated more or less in secret. And so there was this sense of revelation and backlash by the American people and the amount of carnage that was happening. But in terms of framing that movement in the U.S. in what you're bringing to light here of how the conflict was playing out in Vietnam, what did we miss? And what might we learn going forward in future conflicts or in anti-war movements?
Well, that's a great question. I respect the anti-war movements, the activists' commitment to peace. I totally sympathetic with their frustration with their government, U.S. government. and their concerns about U.S. military intervention in Vietnam was causing so much damages to the Vietnamese people. So I totally respect that, and I think opposing U.S. military intervention was correct, was the right thing to do at the time. But unfortunately, the activists misunderstood the nature of the war as a civil war between Vietnamese of different visions for their country. So they were successful in making the U.S. withdraw from Vietnam. But then the ending of U.S. military intervention did not end the war, as I said. So war continued for another 15 years until the communists decided to abandon their revolutionary ambitions and open up the economy, carry out economic reform to give their people a better life. So the movement is called anti-war, but I think that it may be better be called anti-U.S. intervention movement because it stopped there and that's what it achieved, but it did not achieve the end of war in Vietnam. So going forward, I think social movements today can support U.S. involvement in global affairs, not withdrawal from global affairs, involvement, but not by military intervention, but by helping countries find moderate solutions to the conflict and not radical solutions, because the radical solutions oftentimes turn out very badly, did not work for those people. So yes, if U.S. could work with our allies to help reduce conflicts, that would be a great thing.
If you had a moment in an elevator with U.S. diplomacy efforts in Vietnam, given the current political situation in Vietnam, what might you advise?
I would advise continue U.S. involvement and working with the Vietnamese government and giving support on condition of improvement in human rights, because U.S. is the only leverage that can help the Vietnamese people besides themselves to achieve better life with more political freedom. So I hope the U.S. continue to be involved, but work with Vietnamese government on defense and economic issues, but also on the human rights issues.
Could you explore for us what some of the human rights concerns are in Vietnam for those who may not be familiar?
So the Vietnamese government has, in the last decade or so, increased their repressive policies. They have a large army policing the internet. They would arrest people for just minor criticisms of the government on the internet and giving them heavy sentences, like at least 5 years in prison for a few comments. And that stifles any public discussion of anything in Vietnam. And the media, the printed media and the online media have already been fully controlled by the government, except, Facebook and foreign sponsor blogs. But then now the government has been able to block those sites from public access. And so Vietnamese actually have no way of expressing their opinions about the government, and the government cannot be held accountable for the mistaken policies, and that is the result of their repression of human rights.
I'm hearing you advocate for continued engagement, the idea of kind of sticking with a conflict and sticking with it even when it's difficult. I'm almost thinking about this just like human to human. The same idea implies that we can reach a greater level of understanding of one another if we see through the conflict all the way to the other side to really understand the other person's perspective, but that the same can translate to global politics.
I actually have talked a lot about Vietnam already, so I like to talk about the U.S.
Yeah.
Because, like I said, I've been living here for 35 years, right? And I came here when I was much younger. So I've been living here longer than I live in Vietnam, and I've always impressed by this country's egalitarian culture, open attitude, and generosity toward foreigners. I mean, despite the recent tensions and polarization, I think the U.S. still, better than almost all countries in the world when we talk about these values. So we are more open, we are more egalitarian, and we are more generous to outsiders, to foreigners than anywhere else. So I want to express my optimism about the future of the U.S. despite what's going on right now, a lot of frustration and tensions and so on. But given my observation for the last 35 years, I'm still very hopeful.
Thank you, Tuong. I wonder if you'd be up for a quick fire set of questions. These aren't heavy hitters. What's a favorite Vietnamese dish, or where can we go locally to get good Vietnamese food?
Well, my favorite Vietnamese dish is curry. We make good beef curry or beef stew, and we make it with carrots and potatoes. And I know how to make it myself because recently I've been cooking for the family, and I've tried quite a few styles of curry, from Japanese curry to Thai curry to Vietnamese curry. I love what I make, and my family apparently do too. Locally, there are two places that are good enough, and one is For the Good Life, and then the other place is the Saigon Cafe. It's on West 11th Avenue.
We'll link it in the show notes for anyone who's getting hungry listening. Is there a show or a book or a movie that you might recommend if people want to have a better understanding of the U.S.-Vietnam relationship?
Documentary by the German official television made about recent changes in Vietnam, and the title of that documentary is Between Communism and Capitalism. So that really captures the changes in the last 2 decades in Vietnam. That's fair and well-made documentary. And there was a character in the movie who was a young Vietnamese American who came to Vietnam looking to develop a business. And he has been very successful. So there's a great economic boom in Vietnam despite the repression. So that's a nice documentary to watch.
Very cool. And last question, do you have a favorite Vietnamese or American artist or pop music or musician that we could listen to?
There's one, and her name is Đỗ Nguyễn Mai Khôi. She's a singer, and I think she appeared in that documentary, The General. And he's now based in Pittsburgh or Philadelphia, and she's making great music in collaboration with American artists and singers.
Very cool. We'll have to check it out. Tuong, it's just been a delight to have you. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and perspective on this really important period in history and relationship that continues to have global implications. So thank you so much for sharing. I wonder if we might close our time together with a poem.
Oh, please. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. And I want to also thank the University of Oregon, the Division of Global Engagement, and the Global Studies Institute for supporting our center.
Absolutely. We are so delighted to have you. So this is a poem from Honor the Messenger, and it's called Dew and Honey. Sip by sip in thimble cup, the meadow bees will drink it up, then ferry home to bounty's hive by flowers flavor, hum, and thrive, to show us how through word and song, by gesture small and patience long, in spite of our old foolish ways, we may fashion better days. So, my friend, come sip and savor syllables as crumbs of pleasure. By sunrise, in our conversations, we begin a better nation.
That's a lovely poem.
I agree. Thank you so much, Tuong.
Thank you.
Thank you to Ellie Vandegrift, Director of the Global Studies Institute, for your clear leadership and your awesome yes energy. Thank you to GSI team members Megan Bogert and Hadil Abelmaid for your continued teamwork and warm collaborative spirits. Thank you again to Dean and Vice Provost of the Division of Global Engagement, Dennis Galvan, for your fierce advocacy for international education, as well as your leadership in fostering a culture of transparency and curiosity. Immense thanks to our student producer, Ellie Johnson, for your excellent work and journalistic integrity throughout the development of this season. Big thanks to Samantha Para for creating our podcast artwork, as well as dedicated marketing and communications work. And a major shout out to our sound design and audio mastering interns, Journey Brinson and Julian Green, for injecting so much life and personality into each episode through sound design. Huge thanks to Portland-based composer Joe Kai for bringing us all back together each week around the Global Hearth theme song. Once again, thanks to John Sharpie, John Bologna, Charlie Dietz, Steve Rogers, Christopher Deredix, Peter Laufer, and Chris Chavez for concept development. Thank you to Spencer Smith and Richard Menard for communications and distribution assistance, and heartfelt gratitude to Oregon Poet Laureate Kim Stafford for the poems that became a touchstone for each conversation throughout this season. Most of all, thank you to you, our listeners, for your exquisite questions, engagement, and caring attention. We so appreciate your support. If you'd like to keep your ear to the ground for future rumblings from the Global Studies Institute, you can follow us on LinkedIn at University of Oregon Global Ducks, or join our mailing list, which we'll link in the show notes. Your voices are welcome here at the Global Hearth, and you can send questions, comments, and poetry, if you like, to gsi@uoregon.edu. Thank you for joining us here